Some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to Chemtrails on Trial, an 8-part series produced by Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. If you would like access to the entire series right now, join us on patreon.com/Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. The following episode deals with the conspiracy theory. And now, episode 4.
Chemtrails have been mentioned in the United Nations. This is the claim. And there's a video that goes around, and it's from 2007. It's a lady called Rosalind Peterson, who's the president of the Agriculture Defense Coalition. And she reportedly gave a speech at a UN conference talking about the dangers of weather modification and geoengineering. And this is often shared with the title, Chemtrails, here's your proof, 100%. And I've seen this shared on Twitter and shared on Facebook and shared various places quite recently, actually. And it's a lady, say, called Rosalind Peterson of the Agriculture Defense Coalition, and they want to protect water and crops from weather modification experiments. And she says,
one of the things that is affected by climate change is agriculture. But some of what we are seeing is man-made, but man-made in a different way than you may guess. Weather modification programs, experimental ones done by private companies, done by the United States government, done by states across the United States, are underway. There's more than 50 of them in operation across the United States. International corporations are modifying our weather all the time, and they're modifying it in ways that cover thousands and thousands of square miles. Most of it is chemically altered, so that what happens is that we are putting chemicals, ground-based chemicals that are shot into the air, or chemicals coming from airplanes that change and modify our weather.
and at this point, she shows a picture of a contrail with the slogan, "Look up!" with an exclamation point. And it's, it hits home. Anyway.
And so what happens is that many times we're talking about artificially putting chemicals like sulfur or particulates into the atmosphere in what they call geoengineering schemes to reduce and help the planet, supposedly, but help the planet to not go through such a tremendous global climate change and to mitigate global warming. One of the things that is impacting crop production right now in the United States and reducing photosynthesis, and also impacting the ability of solar power panels to generate the type of power that they should, is persistent jet contrails. NASA talks about persistent jet contrails as exacerbating global warming because they trap warmth in the atmosphere when they produce cirrus and man-made clouds. These aircraft leaving persistent contrails are changing our climate. And when they change our climate to the degree that one jet can leave a persistent jet contrail, which will spread across our skies from what this picture up here on my left on the screen looks like, which is a trail left by a jet, that trail can expand to 4,000 kilometers and last for 20 hours. This was unheard of in the early 60s and the 70s, and it wasn't until the late 1980s that there was a change and we started to have persistent jet contrails that persist. And part of what we're doing also is we're sending up canisters. The United States government, NASA, the US Air Force, is sending up canisters into the atmosphere filled with chemicals to modify and experiment with our ionosphere. And when we modify and experiment with our ionosphere up here, we create experiments which they can see through these persistent jet contrails as they stay in the sky for long periods of time, and they can watch the experiments. The type of chemicals they are using are aluminum, barium, strontium.
And That's it, basically. So this is a lady called Rosalind Peterson, and she is really the president of the Agriculture Defence Coalition. And that's what she says. She points out that there are geoengineering programs and there are persistent contrails that even NASA points out are contributing to climate change. And this is billed as the United Nations. So again, what this shows is that there's some acceptance, even in the sort of mainstream world, according to what this says, that these things are real, acknowledged, and actually having an impact. But there's that sort of denial, because in some sense, basically, we've looked at the pattern, we've seen the weather modification and the weapons programs and stuff like that the US government tacitly admits to, or were leaked, if you like. And then there's people speaking like this at the United Nations from organisations concerned with agriculture, and they're bringing it up again. So this is painting a picture. Right, so the main film that's concerned with this is one that's called What in the World Are They Spraying? And this came out in 2010. And this is the one that people have very, very possibly seen. It's the famous one. It's got several people in it. It's G. Edward Griffin. Now, G, I don't think it does, but I speculated it might stand for gangster, and he might be some sort of a rapper. But I don't think he is.
I'll mention here, there is quite a lot of rap songs about chemtrails, if you didn't know.
There are. And Lana Del Rey did a song about chemtrails, apparently.
Really?
Yeah, it's called Chemtrails Over California or some shit or other. I don't know.
I'll have a look. So the one I think of is the official Chemtrails rap by We Are Change Victoria and Digital Clouds by Homage. Check those out.
Oh.
I would suggest check out Trillion. He's an artist from New Zealand. He's done quite a lot of stuff. I used to be like good friends with him, but the truth movement doesn't really like me anymore. But yeah, him.
Did you do any chemtrails songs?
I never did a song.
If you want an all-round dreadful song, Google Chemtrail Cowboy. That is truly the one.
Anyways,
because I'm a chemtrail cowboy. Yeah, you'll know it.
Is that by Gangster Edward Griffin?
No, it's not gangster at all.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, never mind.
It's got some skeletal women dancing in it, though.
Oh, well, there you go. Now, the first thing that I noticed, and I don't wish to sort of stack the evidence against or start off in a negative sense, but the acronym for what in the world are they spraying is Why Twats.
That is brilliant.
Now, I don't want to prejudice anybody, but I did notice that very, very early on. Anyway, so the documentary itself, it's about an hour and a half. It's not a bad documentary. It certainly makes a sort of makes a case, and some of it's quite sort of. It starts with a newsreader.
Could a strange substance found by a Southwest Arkansas man be part of a government test? Well, that's the question at the heart of a phenomenon called chemtrails, now getting widespread attention.
And then they show Fox 31 and the reporter saying,
well, they say the government is dumping chemicals on us to control or manipulate the weather.
And then there's another quote that says,
people say the government is up there in airplanes spraying all kinds of chemicals to change or manipulate the weather, leaving what you see there, and they call that a chemtrail.
And so it says, our journey starts in San Diego, California, where thousands of scientists, engineers, policymakers, and journalists gathered for the American Association to the Advancement of Science conference. One of the topics was the manipulation of the Earth's climate, which is also called geoengineering. During the meeting, scientists spoke about the plausibility of implementing geoengineering campaigns throughout the world under the guise of preventing global warming. One widely accepted theory was to block the sun by spraying something into the atmosphere. When they were asked about existing aerosol programs, they stated clearly that no such programs have ever been implemented. But strangely, these proposals sounded exactly like what people around the world are claiming is already happening. And one scientist at the conference is asked about chemtrails, and he's basically, this is on video, he says that he's personally skeptical about it, but with the government, you just never know. It then cuts to a scene from the New Zealand Parliament.
Global warming.
They claim the American government, with the secret approval of the national government, is covertly using jet aircraft to spray population centres with aluminium, with barium, and with strontium so as to reduce people's immunity and reduce the global population.
And so it's been spoken about all over the place, basically. And then it shows military airplanes dropping chaff. And chaff is a thing that is basically used like, it is not dissimilar to the Welsbeck pattern. They drop particulate out the back of planes, and it creates sort of an artificial cloud cover, and this is to block radar. This is absolutely a real thing again. It basically blocks radar, so the planes that are flying above it can't get picked up, basically. This is a quote from the actual film, and it's David Keith. Now, David Keith is a bit of a villain of this piece because he's somebody that talks about geoengineering. He's one of the big advocates or proponents, or one of the people that is an expert on geoengineering. And he says, we take geoengineering to mean deliberate large-scale intervention in the Earth's systems. Now, here's something as well. He starts talking about alumina, not aluminium, alumina, as Ivor pointed out, that's aluminium oxide. But something that struck me that wasn't picked up on, and is usually picked up on in these types of things, is that alumina sounds very similar to Illuminati.
Oh, shit.
Exactly. And as we know, there are no coincidences. And I was just curious as like, why nobody's picked up on that, that basically not only are they using these chemicals to try and depopulate us, but there's a sort of word game going on there. It's the Illuminati in the sky, the Illumina, the illuminated ones.
And they're illuminating the sky by like the reflective aluminium.
Yeah, you could even take that further and go, basically, the Illuminati are reflecting back the sun. What is the sun a representation of?
Their god.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm surprised Jordan Maxwell never came up with it.
Yeah.
This is my point. There's all sorts of stuff that you could sort of tie into this, basically.
I'm surprised I never came up with it on my blogs.
But yeah, it just struck me when I was reading it back. It's like, hey up. So, but nobody did. Anyway, he says...
Nevertheless, there might be some good reasons to think about alumina. It turns out, first of all, there's been a lot of work on the environmental consequences of alumina in the stratosphere. The big deal really is that alumina has 4 times the volumetric rate of forcing for small particles as does sulfur. And that means you have 4 times less surface area for the same rate of forcing. And this is a much bigger deal. You have roughly 16 times less the coagulation rate. And that's the thing that really drives removal. So you could get away, we think, with much smaller mass fluxes.
Now, what he's talking about here is there are certain proposals within geoengineering to reduce the sun's rays. One of them is to put alumina into the sky, like the Welsbeck pattern. Another one is to inject sulfuric acid into the atmosphere. We're talking about, about 20,000 tons a year. So, a bit. And now that sounds like a huge amount. And basically, apparently that's not that much. There's a huge amount more than that already pumped into the atmosphere. Sounds horrible and it sounds dangerous, and it may well be. But basically, this is an idea that has been proposed that might reduce global warming. So there's sulfuric acid and cloud cover, basically. And it's called increasing the albedo. And the albedo is the reflective surface of the Earth. So something that reflects the rays of the sun back without them getting trapped by the greenhouse gases, so to speak. So again, this is a real conference, and this is a real person concerned with real geoengineering that is basically talking about using something very similar to the Welsbeck pattern to reduce global warming. And he says...
So that's why we see things like in the use aircraft patent from 89, they talk about aluminum. And that's why we're seeing in the surface water samples aluminum.
So this is the documentary basically saying, look, David Keith, this geoengineering guy, he's just talking about spraying aluminium. We've got the pattern. And one of the things that they say in this film is that the evidence that this is harmful is they're finding aluminium in water, they're finding it in snow, and they're finding it in soil, and that they feel that this is detrimental to health. David Keith basically points out that spraying aluminium is easy. And then they show him making this phrase, which sounds a little bit sinister.
And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard. It's more like free riding on our grandkids.
And what this is presented as is something that's very, very sinister, that basically, like, his moral viewpoint, he doesn't care about that. He's willing to try this, even if it's detrimental to our grandchildren. That's how it is framed within the film.
Hello, initiates of the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast. Dom Jolly here. How are you? Sorry to butt in, but I just wanted to let you know that I've written, well, a book that I'm very, very proud of called The Conspiracy Tourist, in which I travel around the world taking a look at the weird world of conspiracies, and I think you might like it. Not only that, but I'm touring the book and doing live shows all around England from the 28th of Feb to the end of March, and it would be smashing to see you there. I think you'd like it. If you are interested, go to my website, www.domjolly.tv. And now, on with the podcast. Thanks.
So, the question is, what would be the effect of these materials on human health if they came down into the stratosphere, particularly these small particles? And David Keith basically says...
So the collaborators of mine working on the aerosol scheme are actually folks from Carnegie Mellon who focused on human health impact.
Oh, they were connected to mind control experiments, you know. In fact, Timothy Leary, when he was kicked out of Harvard, went to the Mellon Hitchcock estate, and that was where they allowed him to continue his, at the time, illegal experiments, and he found out that they were connected to the CIA in certain ways. So, again, potentially a bit of a conspiracy thing going on there. So folks from Carnegie Mellon who focused on human health impacts.
And while we haven't published it, that was the very first thing we did, was do the order of magnitude calculation in level pencil and paper, but with an expert on human health impacts about whether there could be an issue. And for aluminum or other particles, there are a lot of toxicological things that need to get looked at seriously. But if you're just thinking about the sheer number of particles and the human health impact of small particles, the answer is, well, we haven't published it. That was the first thing we looked at with some of the leading experts who do epidemiological research on human health impacts, and it's not even close to being an issue.
Okay, so David Keith at this conference is saying, yeah, it'd be fine. It'd be fine. And so one of the members of the audience, who turns out to be one of the makers of the film, stands up and basically says, are you saying that pumping 10 megatons of aluminium into the atmosphere would have absolutely no health impacts? To which David Keith says, well, the aluminium, we've only just begun to research this, so frankly, we don't know. And the film shows a paper called The In Vitro Toxicity of Aluminium Particles in Rat Alveolar Microphages, implying that basically he's lying. And this is a research paper from the American Air Force, and it shows that aluminium at high levels is toxic, and especially when present for extended periods. So basically what this film is implying is that David Keith and other geoengineers are willing to sort of play God by pumping huge amounts of particulate into the atmosphere, and they well have considered that it might be dangerous, haven't really done the research into it. But the film shows that they've got other papers which imply very heavily that doing this sort of thing would be really, really bad. So Michael Murphy, who's one of the filmmakers, says, well, this is the whole point of what's going to be coming out. It's the damaging effects of aluminium that are being forced onto us around the world. And Stuart Howe, who's another one of the filmmakers, said,
they're proceeding because they have an agenda that's separate from trying to thwart this crisis of global warming. You know, there's obviously several other objectives, whether it's depopulation, control, weapons aspects, communications aspects, all kinds of things, you know, wild cards that we know nothing about. We don't really know, and I'm not going to attempt to speculate on exactly what the agendas are, but we can see clearly the agendas are not benefiting mankind. You know, it's benefiting the agenda of the elite.
One of the things that really shocked me was in one of the breakouts, they had the benefits of these programs and then the risks. Now, the benefits, the one thing that was stated was the just cooling the planet. Some of the risks were ozone depletion, droughts in Africa and Asia.
And so they're presenting these types of programs as like borderline psychotic. Like they're so focused on reducing the temperature of the planet that they're willing to basically cause droughts or kill people in their attempts to do this. And so they reason that global warming is just a front. It must be for some sort of depopulation agenda. And Michael Murphy says that
now this metal, aluminum, is being found in massive quantities way above normal levels all over in rain, in soil, and in snow.
And so they ask gangster Edward Griffin his opinion, and he says,
I'm very aware of the chemtrail versus contrail controversy. As far as I'm concerned, it's an open and shut case.
Now, he doesn't say which way, but I'm assuming because it's about chemtrails that he believes these are chemtrails.
I've been watching jets all my life, and I know about jet contrails. I've watched them. They're vaporized moisture, ice crystals, and they get out there in the atmosphere, and then they effervesce and evaporate and then disappear. These other things we're talking about are not at all the same phenomena at all. These planes go by, and they billow out this white smoke, and it covers the sky from horizon to horizon. It doesn't dissipate at all. And they crisscross each other, and you see this thing cover the sky and turn it milky, and then people start having trouble breathing, and then you hear stories about the aluminum and barium deposits that they're picking up and the residue. And you put it all together, and I don't see how anybody who's got their eyes open and their mind open can come to any other conclusion but that somebody is spending a lot of money and effort to spray the planet. The question is, why?
And he points out that this must be an international plot, a global plot. And essentially what they're doing there is what we spoke about at the beginning, that basically, look, if this is happening all over the world, this implies a new world order or something like that going on, basically. They then go and see a bloke called Dave Wigington. And Dave Wigington basically says,
my goal has been to alert the public there is a mountain of toxic material falling on us.
Before about 5 years ago, our skies were typically blue, and now you see it's covered with lines and haze.
And what he did was he went to a place called Mount Shasta, and he tested some of the snow there. And he picked up the snow, and he's brought it back and run it through laboratory tests. And it says that he tested 61 parts per billion for aluminium. And he says that's 61 times over the government limit. And he says he's concerned about this because this snow will basically, get into the water supply, and hikers are going to be drinking this. And this has got 61 times the safe amount of aluminium in it.
And again, we've already seen in 5 years soil pHs in this area that have escalated 10 to 12 times. And we can prove that conclusively. Well, this is not speculation. We can prove conclusively that these metals have been in the rain. We have duplicate samples.
And he gets the help of a biologist called Francis Mangels. And he's testing his soil in his garden. He says, when I started this garden back in 2005, the pH here was 5.5 or 5.6. And he says that the sample shows it's now 6.8 at places. And so what he's saying is it's becoming more alkali. And he attributes this to the aluminium, which is being sprayed, coming down in the rain, as is shown in the soil samples, and this is affecting him. There's his neighbour as well, who's a lady called Mahia Sol, and she says that she collects the rainwater and she uses a HEPA filter, and she found aluminium at 7%. So 7% of this water is aluminium, and she's very, very concerned about that. The documentary also goes to show that they tested a local pond. They actually said that they tested the water and the crust on the top of the pond, and they found aluminium and barium at astonishingly high levels. They found 375,000 parts per billion of aluminium, which is massively, massively high. And if they're suggesting that this is very, very dangerous. And they speak to a gentleman called Dr. Lenny Time, who also sounds a bit like a rapper.
Yeah.
And he says the way that acidity is reduced in soil is by aluminium, that this is a well-known phenomenon, and that he thinks that the major toxin in these chemtrails is probably aluminium. And they interview this Dr. Time.
Aluminum is a very specific, nasty, and biological systems. It takes that site and it never lets go, and it shuts down the site, and that's it.
And the film says that there's loads of weather manipulation programs that the public doesn't even know about, and they cite the Owning the Weather document that we spoke about earlier. And they also mention the rise in Alzheimer's, and they imply that chemtrails, because the tests that they're showing in the soil and the water and the snow show aluminium. Aluminium is a cause of Alzheimer's, and that they've noticed that there's a rise in Alzheimer's and there's a rise in respiratory diseases. They also noticed that over the past few years, blamed on global warming, but there's an increase in wildfires. And what they think is that the aluminium particles are mixed with magnesium, and that these are basically making the trees ultra flammable. Again, scary if true. They also point out that basically they tested in Phoenix as well, and they found 39,000 parts per million of aluminium in the air, and that this is far too much. They speak to a lady called Deborah Whitman, who's very, very concerned with the trees are dying en masse, and whenever we test the soil around these trees, we're finding aluminium. They go to Hawaii, and they see a huge amount of trees, all coconut trees, all the same trees, and they've all died, like in this forest. They're all very, very ill-looking, and they say that basically there was chemtrails just prior to all these trees dying. There's also a woman who does a hair analysis test on her daughter that shows high levels of aluminium. It says that there's a level of 23.1, and it shows that the reference range is 17.3, so it shows that this is actually a little bit too high. And then G. Edward Griffin speculates that
then we discover, as we're going further down the line, that there are companies generating genetically modified organisms, or seeds, modified seed crops they're being engineered to resist the aluminum in the soil. A lot of crops won't grow in that, and so now, after they've messed up the soil, all the farmers were going to have to go back and buy seeds that have been genetically engineered to resist the aluminum that have been put into the soil. And all of a sudden, mankind is completely dependent upon these companies like Monsanto and other giant agricultural firms. You can't even grow natural seeds anymore.
And they also speculate that the chemtrails are there to stop the natural food growing. The explanation that is put forward by the sort of mainstream, that these persistent chemtrails are just ice particles, they say that's laughable. One of the persons says that that's just a lie. Like, that's just ice, that's just condensation. You could talk to a second grader, and they will know that ice doesn't float in the sky, and it doesn't spread out that way. So, fairly conclusive. They think that the explanation for it is nonsense, basically. There's then quite a bit of filler in this documentary. They go to Belgium, and they meet the former mayor of Evergum, who's a bloke called Peter Verrecke, who seems to believe in chemtrails. He's actually a PhD in aerospace engineering. So, he's got credentials, but he mostly talks about UFOs and occasionally about 9/11. Those are his major areas of interest, but he also believes in chemtrails. And then they introduce a lady called Desiree Rover, who says that we're being dumbed down, we're being made sicker, and we're being made infertile. And she implies that this is due to the chemtrails. And then they speak to Koen Verhoeven, who's a uni professor, and he says that it worried me too. I have no explanation for my students about these phenomenon. Then I studied it myself, and I found out I can't give them the answers they wanted because I think that the phenomenon is not natural. And it's like, it's not, is it? It comes out of an engine, but it's a plane, right? So no, it's not natural. Yeah. So, but I don't think that's what he means. But anyway. And then for some reason, somebody mentions the Hegelian dialect and problem reaction solution.
Cool. For some reason, let's just throw that in.
Well, they sort of vaguely tie it back into we'll have to buy Monsanto seeds if everything dies. It is a little bit thin.
It's interesting because of the different weather modification programs. There's something like, I think, right around 32 in the continental U.S. alone going on. So the theory is that geoengineering is in part weather modification.
And the sort of denouement of the film, they go to Washington and they start shouting at politicians. They basically keep asking them about chemtrails. They speak to Dianne Feinstein, someone called Hank Johnson, Barbara Mikulski, Randy Neugebauer, Cliff Stearns, James Clapper, who's the director of the National Intelligence Agency, and absolutely none of them have heard of either chemtrails or plans for geoengineering. So they think that this is obviously a cover-up. They speak to Catherine Redwell, who's a professor of international law, and she says, governance is not simply an issue of deployment, but governance before deployment, particularly of large-scale scientific fieldwork. So what they're doing here is they're trying to use a lawyer to say that this is incredibly irresponsible of the government to be doing these programs that they feel that this documentary has proved has happened by the experiments that they've done. And Stuart Howe basically says, when there's people that start talking about the need for the United Nations Security Council oversight or a supranational environment enforcement with a strong mandate by the United Nations, it really is clear they're looking for a global power behind the manipulation of the environment. So right at the end, they just basically tie it in with the New World Order stuff. And then they finish on a quote from Geoengineering 2. Electric Boogaloo, Scientific Basis and Engineering Challenges. And he says,
we see that even though we might make the average temperature of the planet about right, the rainfall patterns change some from today. And some places become warmer and some places become cooler. So there are going to be winners and losers in this geoengineering activity if we were to do it. But nevertheless, as David has said, there are reasons why we might consider doing it.
So, again, what they're doing there is they're implying that they don't care. They're going to do these geoengineering programs, and according to their evidence, that it's already happening.
Thank you for listening to Chemtrails on Trial, produced by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders for Some Dare Call It Conspiracy. And don't forget, if you can't wait for next week, do join us on patreon.com/somedarecallitconspiracy, where you'll not only be able to get the entire series right now, but also ad-free episodes, plus tons of other goodies, including my music, Neil's books, audiobooks of Neil's, and art by Nicholas C. Gray. You can also find all our links at www.somedarecallitconspiracy.com.